My name is Phoebe Stirling, and this work is something my colleague Sonia Abachi and I, both at UCL, have been doing in the context of a large European research project. The lecture, I've actually got a slightly different name here. I've called it Understanding Housing Inequalities in the Context of the UK's Green Transition. But for those of you who've been following this lecture series, this is also in this context of this much bigger European research project, which is trying to understand housing inequalities and the green transition across Europe. So it's a large project, 9 European countries. We have Norway, Poland, Hungary, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, France, Spain, and the UK. And we're all trying to understand the effects of green transition activities or strategies on housing inequalities in these different countries. And we have many discussions about how we understand housing inequalities. But in the context of this lecture, I'm going to put forward that we're thinking about affordability, access, and stability in housing. So to do this, it's a long project. It's a 3-year project. We've had various kinds of analysis. We've had document analysis, social statistics. We've done focus groups. We've conducted many interviews, and also done some stakeholder engagement to really speak with different people who are engaged in housing provision and the provision of these green activities at different levels and different scales. So just to introduce the kind of green initiatives, the green activities, these green sisters, as we've been calling them at UCL, we have domestic retrofitting, nature-based solutions, and densification. And that's something that we're all the countries are looking at across our cases, right? So domestic retrofitting would be upgrading existing residential properties with energy efficient technologies. And that's a strategy to improve the energy efficiency, right, of the building stock. Nature-based solutions, again, is a kind of, this one's an umbrella term, really. It's a climate adaptation strategy, which would include things like urban greening, green space, adding new green space to urban areas, sustainable urban drainage systems, but all of them utilizing nature for this adaptation strategy goals. Densification is really a strategy for sustainable land use. And that will include, for example, transit-oriented development, so integrated transport systems, reducing the reliance on cars. You might have eco-neighborhoods and compact living, which would kind of counter urban sprawl and allow residents to access essential services in a kind of 15-minute walk or bike ride, those kinds of things. You also have, under densification, the redevelopment of industrial brownfield sites, so cleaning contaminated industrial sites. You might have integrating green spaces into previously paved spaces. But this densification one, you know, we see clearly retrofitting, certainly a green sister, nature-based solutions, very obviously an environmental initiative. In the UK context, and I think this is important to understanding the whole UK context really, densification isn't strictly a green agenda or a green activity, right? So in many European contexts, these ambitions around densification are very connected to sustainability. In the UK, there are more established drivers of higher density development, right? Not associated with sustainability. So nationally, we have a policy preference for a generic supply approach to addressing affordability issues. And this filters through from the national level to various tiers of government to push supply. We also have viability frameworks that incentivize developers to build maximum numbers of market units on a given site. So I do just think that is a really important distinction for the UK. There is this densification, not, and we'll come to it. I'll speak about densification more. So in terms of the whole project and what we're trying to understand, first of all, whether these green strategies or initiatives exacerbate or mitigate housing inequalities, but also, and perhaps more importantly, If they do, how, right? So what are the mechanisms in different contexts that can make housing inequalities more or less likely in the context of these green initiatives that are being implemented? So it's worth pointing out here that the green initiatives we are looking at are all implemented through the built environment, right? So we're not talking about the kind of landscape policies in very deep rural areas. But in the UK case, this is also especially true. So the policy frameworks for these initiatives mean that it is the producers and the providers of housing who implement them, right, through the housing supply system. And again, I'm going to come back to that and explain the implications for housing inequalities later. So an important concept for us to understand the relationship between environmental actions and housing inequality outcomes is green gentrification. And broadly, I would say we've gone into this project with this as a hypothesis that, how does green gentrification happen? And some of the ideas we have at the starting point are greening can lead to higher housing and living costs and affect particularly poorer social groups. Greening initiatives can drive green or ecological gentrification by drawing wealthier groups of residents in and pushing out disadvantaged groups. Strategies to improve the energy efficiency of the building stock has been linked to rising house prices, also renoviction when tenants are evicted so that a landlord can raise the price of a retrofitted dwelling. Densification areas are often characterized by prohibitive housing prices and targeted to more affluent groups, and they kind of draw the eco-conscious middle-class elites driving these gentrification dynamics. And again, similar to this, low-carbon lifestyles become more desirable, so middle and upper income residents choose to live near public transport hubs and these higher density mixed-use areas. So that's broadly our understanding of this kind of relationship between, on the one hand, environmental policies, and on the other hand, housing inequalities. In this project, we're also considering the housing system, right, which is part of the welfare system or the welfare regime, because, as I said, these initiatives are implemented through the built environment, and in the UK, through the provision of housing. So the housing system is understood here from a welfare perspective. So welfare theory looks at the relationship between the state, the non-profit sector, the market, and also the family and the individual in the creation and the redistribution of resources and welfare services, right? So this emphasis on these four different aspects slightly challenges a focus on a kind of market versus state argument. We're looking kind of more broadly at the different institutional arrangements involved in the provision of welfare goods. And it's through this relationship that welfare goods are distributed, and that's welfare goods such as housing, but also kind of climate goals. We can think of all of these things as welfare goods. And as a project, we've looked at how this relationship is organized differently in each society in our case study countries. And we've also understood this relationship as determining the degree of commodification and decommodification of these welfare goods. So that just gives you a little bit of a lens on how we're kind of approaching housing and greening in the project. So thinking about climate goals as a welfare good introduces systemic thinking in analyzing these three green sisters, right? We see them as part of a broader system. And in the UK, we argue that these green policy initiatives have been shaped by the same welfare restructuring that's driven the commodification of housing, right? So equity implications are then determined by the way that climate goals and the housing system, which are each directed by the welfare system, collide. And we do see green gentrification, but we're interested in how green initiatives exacerbate housing inequalities because of how the welfare system works and the interaction of the green initiatives with the housing supply system. So I'm going to just discuss each one in order and look first of all at domestic retrofitting in the UK, and then discuss some of our cases and how they kind of really illustrate how this works in the UK. So the main driver of retrofitting policy in the UK is the legally binding climate obligations made by the UK as part of the Paris Agreement and subsequent commitments. And the UKCCC has stated that to achieve the UK's climate obligations, a rate of residential retrofits must increase to 500,000 each year by 2025 and to 1 million per year by 2030. However, the UK is significantly off track in this rate. And in their recent progress report to Parliament, the UNCCC stated that energy efficiency measure installations in homes are moving in the wrong direction. Right? So we're not seeing retrofits at the scale that's required to meet our national obligations. These are the next couple of slides are really just to kind of emphasize that point. In the UK, the energy efficiency of a home is measured by its EPC rating. So this kind of central tile just shows 3 out of 5 are a score D and below, which sort of shows the scale of the requirement. And here we can see this kind of line of travel of how domestic retrofitting has declined since 2012 in the UK. So the main implementation process of retrofits is through publicly funded programs that are designed to support the retrofit of the UK's housing stock, which fall into these 4 categories. Crucially, though, and as I said, these are things that are done through the housing supply system, through the housing provision system. These schemes provide funds to those who are responsible for providing the housing stock, right? The owners, the landlords, the housing associations. It provides them with funds to retrofit their own properties, right? So we have supplier obligation schemes. This is legislation obliging energy companies, they're the suppliers of the supplier obligation schemes. Energy companies need to offer retrofit improvements to their own customers, and they spread the cost between the customers that they have. You have pay-as-you-save schemes, which are programs allowing consumers to directly apply for loans to cover the cost of retro improvements to their own homes or to homes that they rent. And those are repaid through savings to energy bills. And then we have publicly funded schemes for owner-occupiers and the PRS. And we have publicly funded schemes for social housing providers. So what we don't have is kind of schemes rolled out, public schemes rolled out, but rather that the people who are owning the housing stock are receiving some public funds to help with the costs of retrofit. So these schemes, I think, is another really important thing to understand. They're not intended to increase the number of homes with retrofit measures at scale, right? So the amount of funding that's available on offer to the people who are wanting to retrofit their properties is not sufficient to achieve retrofit at scale. They're intended to build up the supply side of the retrofit market, right, by first encouraging a level of demand. So the idea is that the number of contractors will rise and technological development will improve if only we have better demand for retrofit products. And so that's the side we're going to fund rather than funding the provision of retrofit. So in terms of how this relates to the broader provision of welfare goods in the UK, we argue that the governance structures determining how retrofit is rolled out are underpinned by the same welfare regime principles that govern the existing UK housing system, right? Which is a policy preference to stimulate economic activity by recommodifying the supply of welfare goods, right? In housing supply, that might be a shift from direct delivery of social housing by local authorities to housing allowances or Section 106 obligations that provide subsidized housing through the market, right? So then that's situated within this broader historical shift from state-led investment in the supply of welfare goods to policies that stimulate the supply by investing in demand. Meanwhile, the retrofit industry will need a significant public investment and improved coordination to address the high costs of retrofits. I think it's really important to emphasize the importance of this industry, the retrofit industry, in this issue here. So by pulling investment away from this supply side, the industries that support the production of green goods, and shifting support to incentivize demand, there is a loss that is more than the sum of the finance involved, right? I think crucially, coordination suffers. And then this is something we can look back to in the fragmentation of provision, right? And I'll come to that later, but the provision of these green goods becomes more fragmented. And that's something that ultimately raises costs and ultimately, therefore, has implications for inequalities. Just to bring it back to some of our cases, we have been looking at Islington in London, the London Borough of Islington. And this is actually a quotation of theirs, a direct quotation. The council will need the government to make significant and ongoing funding available in order to deliver our ambition for Islington. For instance, the cost of retrofitting the council housing stock to become both energy efficient and zero carbon is in excess of what the council can afford with existing resources. This also applies to private housing and social housing provided by other organisations. Funding needs to be made available on a consistent, ongoing basis, with reasonable time given for applications to be processed and funds spent. This will enable the development of high-quality proposals, provide stability and security for the delivery in industry and reduce costs. That would make you think from some of the documents on their website. I'm sorry, I've got some work being done next door, so I'm going to shut my door and hope that keeps things a bit more quiet. In terms of, just thinking about retrofit, in terms of mechanisms creating inequalities, the cost of retrofit measures remains prohibitively expensive for most of the population, right? So that industry investment, while that's missing, the industry hasn't been able to bring down the cost of retrofit so that it's available more broadly. Supplier obligation schemes, which are intended for lower income households, prioritize the cost and the efficiency of the measures over their quality and appropriateness. So that's often resulted in retrofits which are only partial or sometimes poorly installed. And we've had a lot of discussion in the UK about retrofit measures actually increasing things like damp and mold in people's homes. The narrow and complex eligibility requirements of these schemes can exclude properties with the most severe housing deficiencies, so houses that are in disrepair or that are damp or have mold. And that locks households in the poorest quality housing out of these schemes. We also find that middle-income households are often ineligible for support, but then unable to self-fund, so they're also locked out of being able to benefit from retrofitting measures. There's also some implications for social housing providers, because with the funds that are available for social housing providers, they need to match funds, which means that they're facing an additional cost to their usual social housing delivery programs. So with social housing providers facing a range of costs, this can really be prohibitive to affordable housing delivery. It's simply increasing the cost burden on social housing providers. Again, I wanted to kind of draw this down to our cases, speaking to local housing providers. One has said, but you've still got this really hard position in terms of there just isn't enough cash. So you're not generating that level of income to be able to offset the additional costs that the greening actually brings to it. If the government really wants this to happen, they're going to have to put the money where their mouth is. They can't expect providers, that's housing providers, to keep doing retrofitting because they're just going to go under. I can't find anybody who disagrees with the ambition and the desire, but how are we actually going to do it? Let's get down to the actual delivery details of how we maintain that. So that was a bit about retrofit. I'm going to speak about nature-based solutions in the UK now, and we can see some kind of parallels in the way the system is organised. The main policy for NBS provision in the UK is biodiversity net gain, which is legislation that outlines the responsibility of the private sector to deliver NBS for all new housing development. So developers must ensure a minimum of 10% net gain biodiversity in order to secure planning permission. And before any construction, developers must measure the existing biodiversity values of each site and present a plan to show how at least 10% gain in biodiversity value will be achieved. So that's on the developer side. On the local authority side, local authorities must have a local nature recovery strategy in place to guide the private sector delivery of NBS, right? So quite like a local development plan, this sort of normal planning process, these new local nature recovery strategies are plans that are designed by the local authority, setting out their vision for the area. So they might provide specific requirements, specific biodiversity conditions that must be acknowledged by the private sector when they are applying for planning permission for new development. And for this, local authorities need to establish their own frameworks for monitoring and assessing and indicators, and often require developing a whole new layer of expertise. I can speak a little bit also about the biodiversity credits market, which is it's central to developers' ability to kind of compensate for or offset NBS provision where it's not possible on site. We haven't really spoken in depth through any of our cases about this, but it's a really interesting feature of the kind of NBS environment in the UK. So off-site biodiversity delivery is coordinated through a biodiversity credits market, which allows developers to buy units of land, basically, from habitat creation projects to meet their obligations off-site rather than on-site. And it's quite a new market. It's relatively uncoordinated. It's in places very unregulated. So that means that developers can make their investment decisions perhaps according to the simplest and most straightforward options available, not always in terms of the kind of best social or biodiversity value. So again, we would argue that the governance structures determining how nature-based solutions are rolled out in the UK are underpinned by the same welfare regime principles that governs the existing UK housing system, right? So biodiversity net gain, I would compare this to Section 106, which is Section 106 of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004, where a proportion of all newly developed housing provided by private developers must be affordable, right? Which is rather than affordable housing being provided directly or on its own terms. So in the same way, BNG represents an obligation to provide, in this case, green welfare goods as a condition of operating in the private market. So again, it represents a policy preference to stimulate economic activity by kind of recommodifying the supply of welfare goods. And this might make sense with the next slide, but also there are cases where policy compliance, where a housing provider needs to provide a certain amount of social housing, meaning that neither affordable housing nor greening can be reduced. Developers can face a pressure to treat environmental assets as a commodity, right? So if you have a housing association who have received public funding for the acquisition of land, this can create an obligation for a high level of affordable homes, right? This was the case in both of our London case studies in Islington and Barking and Dagenham. But then when combined with the additional costs of biodiversity net gain on top, that creates a financial pressure for that housing provider. And we can see some implications. So there is, with the added cost of biodiversity net gain, the potential that numbers of social and affordable homes delivered will be reduced. because this cost, both on and off site, is a recent addition to housing providers' costs, right? The new regulations also increase the number and the range of consultancies that housing providers need to pay for. They're doing biodiversity net gain assessments, they're employing landscape architects, they're doing ongoing reporting. For social housing providers, there's also these rising delivery and maintenance costs that means that getting affordable housing schemes to work is much harder. And on sites developed by private developers, these rising costs associated with their BNG could lead to a reduced numbers of social homes in new developments. So this was not the case in our London cases, both of which were developed by a housing association and received a grant from the Greater London Authority for land acquisition. So there was an obligation to provide a very high level of affordable homes. But we can speak about then that pressure that when it's a private developer, they can bring down their social home contributions. For a housing association, they can't. And so that then creates other financial pressures that need to be released elsewhere. So with the private market delivery, what we have is nature viewed as an asset and as something that enhances real estate value. A significant category of impact here could be the value of residential properties and therefore the potential for green gentrification, as we've discussed in neighbourhoods benefiting from NBS interventions. But as we said, that's all new development, right? They're benefiting from these NBS interventions. Where developers are designing their plans with enhancing property values in mind, they can pursue quite a limited range of NBS or maybe not the greatest natural or social value in these newly developed areas. And bigger private developers may be able to reduce their BNG contributions, right, on account of rising costs. So other aspects of sustainability, such as sustainable construction technologies, reduced use of concrete is another one, all of which add costs to a development. These can be the areas when you can't reduce your BNG, when you can't reduce your social housing. Sometimes it means that there's a reduced spend elsewhere. So again, drawing this down to some of our experiences in our cases, these are some quotes from across our cases. So we've spoken to people in Blackpool and Bicester and Islington and Barking and Dagenham. And they've said, we'll deliver less affordable housing because we've spent more money on the quality of what we're delivering. I completely support that we need to do stuff around biodiversity net gain. On the other hand, when you can't get a housing scheme away, because either you've got to pay so much money to spend it somewhere outside the city, or you're losing chunks of land, which you would otherwise develop for BNG, you think, I'm not sure we've got this right. Someone else said, what am I trying to say? Oh, supporting value creation. So a development that's set within a beautiful, attractive landscape is likely to be able to hit higher sales values. Developers and housing associations have recognised how the delivery of a beautiful, biodiverse landscape will assist with value creation. And this quotation I thought was really, really interesting about those trade-offs elsewhere. There was an expectation on us as a developer that we would do everything on this site. Every single thing would be done on this site to satisfy everything, and we couldn't make it work technically and commercially. And we ended up writing a document called Green Things We're Not Doing and Why, and putting that in with the planning application, which was saying, well, and that's where I think sometimes there's things elsewhere in a development. Sometimes it's going to be affordable housing that will be reduced. Sometimes it will be the BNG obligations themselves that will be reduced. And sometimes we'll see other aspects of a development and things that provide other sustainability measures or other aspects of quality to a development that are pulled away. Moving on to densification in the UK, which, as I've said, is a slightly more complicated in terms of qualifying it as a green initiative. In the UK, we have quite a long history of hard densification through the regeneration of social housing estates, brownfield and active industrial areas, with local authorities acting as enablers of private sector development to unlock densification. So it's a complicated policy history, but a fundamental thread here has been the goal of drawing private investment into the housing supply system. And all the stages of policies that have essentially been densification policies usually pertain to this thread of trying to incentivize private investment into the built environment and the housing system. The first generation of regeneration, and we're thinking particularly about London here, which has been a kind of a petri dish for these policies in the UK, involved the demolition of social housing estates to be replaced with mixed tenure neighbourhoods, right? So increasing only occupation and private rent in any area. These required local authorities to sell public land to developers as part of public-private partnerships. They relied on non-profit housing providers for the new social housing production. So that was often drawing on the Section 106 type arrangements. In the second generation of regeneration, we've seen a really interesting scaling up of the role of non-profit housing providers, and often stepping into that role that the local authority used to play in terms of being the landowner and the kind of coordinating partner. So the sort of non-profit private joint venture has replaced this previous mechanism of a kind of public-private partnership. And the non-profit, usually a housing association or another provider, acquires land and housing from local authorities and other housing associations, or sometimes receives funds to buy that land before creating a joint venture with a large private developer. There's some other policies. I don't want to get too much into the weeds because it is quite complex. But I've already described Section 106 for affordable housing provision. We've had, for the housing revenue account, borrowing caps. Really, that was just a sort of limiting of local authority control over being able to spend money on housing. So a kind of centralization of the financial abilities of local authorities. And yet local authorities being required to self-finance a greater proportion of their services. So sometimes that gets called penniless devolution. And then policies pushing for densification and regeneration, such as the right to regenerate in 2020. So in terms of the mechanisms creating inequalities through these densification policies, the UK planning system has essentially rendered local authorities as enablers of densification rather than active shapers of the densification agenda. This encourages the gentrification of areas designated for regeneration with limited local authority involvement, meaning that the densification agenda creates the foundations for new forms of affordable housing provision by the private and the non-profit sector. It also limits the possibility of direct housing delivery by local authorities. So social housing delivery relies completely on cross-subsidy from private tenure production. So it's completely reliant on the growth of private tenures. I wanted to talk here specifically about our case of Northwest Bicester Eco Town, which is a 390-hectare site extension to the town of Bicester on a greenfield development. And this was a response to the UK government's Eco Town Planning Policy Statement in 2004, which sought to incentivise the creation of towns with zero carbon emissions through sustainable building standards and microgeneration of clean energy. So on the face of it, that more European understanding of a kind of sustainable densification. But it's also clear through the work that we've done on this project that the district really sought to use this framework as a means of increasing housing supply. So I think that just goes back to my point about densification being not uncomplicatedly about sustainability in the UK. And it's also vulnerable to all the same mechanisms that I've been speaking about of the commodification of that supply. So because the housing supply is commodified in all these ways, actually the densification of this area and the supply of housing, but also of the green aspects of this development are commodified. So as the developers, and we spoke to various people in this case, said there's a challenge of viability when you're looking more strategically at implementing more sustainable measures and delivering more efficient buildings. And someone else said, oh, well, if you do all this, we can only do 5% affordable housing or whatever. They were trying to genuinely do everything and found that it didn't add up. So what do you do then? You go and have a chat with the policymakers and you say, well, which one gives? And then specifically in this case, they said there was a concern that we were in effect creating a lifestyle choice for people. Well, in effect, that was what was going on. So as people are trying to recoup their costs of providing and supplying the housing and the green initiatives, there's an attempt to recoup those costs elsewhere. Now, again, whether that's through less affordable housing, whether that's through sort of asset creation through greening, there's various ways that that moves us towards a kind of gentrifying dynamic. I'm just going to pause on the welfare system for a little while, because I've been trying to sort of draw a link between these green initiatives and the welfare system in the UK. In the UK, the green policy initiatives that we've been speaking about are manifested through the built environment, through the housing supply system, and are therefore reproducing long-standing residential inequalities. This is since they're kind of replicating those structural mechanisms of the national housing system that have been producing residential inequalities since the late 1970s. So what does this look like? We have policy interventions intended to lubricate the flow of private rather than public investment into housing, also the green initiatives. We're stimulating economic activity by the recommodification of the supply of public goods or welfare goods. We're shifting our stimulus from the production of housing or green initiatives to consumption. And so as the macroeconomic machinery driving economic activity does that by propping up demand rather than actually investing in the production and provision of housing and green goods, that simply drives the acceleration of economic rent, the extraction of economic rent from the housing system. There's a couple of experiences here that just illustrate this, I think. Planning inspectors have weakened their enforcement. I would have thought that something that was set out in law and enshrined in the planning legislation, which said 30% affordable housing, would be enforced. But oh no, I was really shocked and horrified that they would allow this to be weakened. But then you also say we're desperate for social housing. Is 10% of something better than 30% of nothing? And then this one kind of sums it up really, and we heard this over and over and over in the UK case. Housing provision, society, planning, how shall I improve the quality of life of people in this area? I know, I'll give them well-insulated houses. I will provide houses for social rent. I shall have a lot of open space that's well managed, and the schools will be good and life will be great. Oh, how do I do that then? I'm actually going to, just for the sake of time, pause on this slide. Just this is my kind of summary of the fundamental mechanisms that I've been describing through all these different green initiatives. Firstly, just at the top here, we can see that there's been a fundamental shift in the recommodification of land, right? So we see a transfer of the value inherent in land from the public to the private sector. That's occurring in the housing system and also in the provision of green goods. Less in retrofit, but certainly for NBS and for densification, we see that transfer of land. This transfer has, as in the housing sector, led to rising land prices and rising costs in the production of welfare goods. Associated to this, and you can see there's a kind of plus there because these things are happening alongside one another, we see residualist funding structures. So there's fewer funding streams available. They're increasingly marginal. And as in the housing sector, they aim to stimulate the supply of retrofit, of NBS, of densification by investing in demand, and therefore have similarly done little to reduce the cost of production, right? And this has led to high costs in the market for welfare goods, like domestic retrofit. Meanwhile, the demand-based schemes that dominate public intervention reproduce the housing inequalities of those living in the poorest quality housing. So the funding streams are doing little to bring the costs down. We also see, alongside this kind of commodification of land and residualist funding, we've got a proliferation of market intermediaries. So the lack of funding and the recommodification of land has undermined the ability of public bodies like local authorities to engage in direct provision of these welfare goods. We therefore see a proliferation of intermediary stakeholders indirectly contributing to and raising the costs of production. So, for example, in densification projects, we see the private and non-profit sector stepping in. We see raising revenue requirements and reducing the number of social homes in production. In NBS, both private and social housing providers are compelled to pay for a range of consultancies for on-site delivery. That's also raising costs. Where on-site delivery is too costly, we see an emerging biodiversity credits market. We see many more intermediaries in this space, and that's raising the costs of production. And then again, next to the increase in market intermediaries, and this is an aspect I find particularly interesting, we've seen the fragmentation of governance and market frameworks, right? So as governance and industrial structures become increasingly fragmented, the coordination of the supply side of these industries is weakened, right? So coordination is a really important part of what is lacking in the current welfare arrangement in the UK. So what that also means is then policy interventions end up poorly designed. For example, the retrofit sort of schemes, those policies don't really have an understanding of how that industry works. Civil servants can lack understanding of the supply side. And then this is also exemplified by huge amounts of retrofit funding being returned after local authorities are unable to deliver. So you end up having higher costs on account of a kind of market fragmentation, governance fragmentation through poor coordination. And then what all of these things add up to as well is that the institutions are getting larger in size. So there's this fragmented space where the size of institutions involved with provision has become a significant factor in their success. So institutions involved in production and provision of housing, of green goods, need increasing amounts of capital to acquire land. Smaller institutions lack the heft to negotiate down their costs or negotiate down their planning obligations and find production increasingly unviable. We've also seen many mergers and acquisitions in the housing association sector, and institutions start to recognize that size is the way to achieve success. So these costs, all of these different factors, increase the cost of production, and these costs are ultimately shunted along to end users, entrenching the already existing housing inequalities. I think we'll end there.